Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to this panel. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. My name is Yasser Munif, and I teach at Emerson College in Boston, and I'm also a member of the Global Prison Abolitionist Coalition, which is organizing this panel. The Global Prison Abolitionist Coalition, or GPAC, was established last year, 2020, after the COVID pandemic eruption, to advocate for abolition of prisons and police forces globally. The coalition is anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist, but it also rejects the simplistic anti-imperialism of some in the left who consider Russia, China, Syria, or Iran as allies. That sectarian left thinks state violence and prisons in these countries as acceptable because these governments claim to be anti-imperialist. GPAC is anti-authoritarian, decolonial, anti-patriarchal, and internationalist. In addition, the coalition is trying to build organic relationships with abolitionist groups in countries in the global south. Global abolitionism is more than abolition of prisons or the police. It's also the abolition of borders, the right of people to move freely. Abolition in many parts of the world also means the right to self-determination. The coalition has several ongoing campaigns, including one that documents the struggle of female prisoners and disappeared women. And you can learn more about the coalition and our work at worldwithoutprisons.org. Today's panel is titled Global Prison Rebellions and Racial Capitalism. The panel marks the 50th anniversary of the Attica rebellion, the racism, abuse, and dehumanization of prisoners at Attica prison sparked a heroic uprising on September 9th, 1971. And the rebellion lasted 4 days. The rebellion, which resulted in a massacre, exposed state violence and white supremacy, and showed that prisoner struggles cannot be delinked from the long history of Black national liberation and international anti-imperialism. The panelists will examine the long history of prison rebellions in the United States and the global south, namely Palestine and Brazil. They will discuss prison rebellions as vital sites of resistance against state violence and racial capitalism. These rebellions, then and now, are interconnected and should be understood as outposts of struggle against neoliberalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, Zionism, and carceral regime. And in addition to the GPAC organizing the panel is also sponsored by Revive the Peace Movement, the Middle East and North Africa Socialist Alliance, the Du Bois Center at UMass, and Adallah Justice Project. And please check their websites, and their information is available on our Facebook page. We have 3 outstanding panelists today. It's my pleasure to introduce them. Voilà. And we'll start with Juliana Góes, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She holds a master's degree in political science at Federal University of Minas Gerais and a BA in political science, University of Brasilia. She has published the following articles: Success Science and Epistemologies, Situated Knowledge, and Theoretical and Analytical Approaches on Prostitution. She's currently working on a book project titled Du Bois on Latin America and the Caribbean, Trans-American Pan-Africanism and Global Sociology. Additionally, she studies the connection between decolonial praxis, urban politics, and Black movement in Latin America. Her dissertation theme, which is also her dissertation theme, she's also working on a wide range of social movements in the Americas. She has collaborated with sex workers organizations, Black urban settlements, and anti-prison movements. Next, we have Anthony Ratcliff, who's a long-standing friend and 10-year associate professor in the Department of Pan-African Studies at California State University, Los Angeles. He earned a PhD in African American Studies from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2009. His dissertation analyzed the Pan-African politics of cultural struggles, with particular attention paid to the international dimension of the Black art movements. As a critical hip-hop educator and radical historian, Anthony's scholar activist research and teaching interests include revolutionary Black arts and politics, Black anti-authoritarian and autonomous movements, Black feminist theory and praxis, decolonial activism and organizing, the impact of capitalism and mass incarceration on hip-hop cultural production, and the abolition of policing and prison. And finally, we have Milena Ansari from Palestine, Jerusalem. I forgot to say that Juliana is in Brazil. Milena Ansari is an international advocacy officer at Ad-Damir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, a Palestinian human rights organization that works to support and advocate on behalf of Palestinian political prisoners held in Israeli and Palestinian prisons by providing free legal aid to prisoners, advocating for them nationally and internationally, and working to end torture and other violation of prisoners' rights through monitoring, legal procedure, and solidarity campaigns. And I think with these fascinating speakers, we're going to have a really interesting panel. So why don't we start with you, Juliana?
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to start thanking the organization of the event.
We can't hear you. I think you are muted.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
No, you still can hear me? Oh, okay. So, great. Sorry. So first, I would like to thank you. Thank the organization of the event.
I think others can hear you. Go ahead.
It is really nice to be here and exchanging strategies of resistance across countries. I would like to start talking a little bit about Brazil and situating what means prisons in Brazil. At the same time, I will be sharing my screen. So give me 1 second. Can you all see my screen? Okay. Give me 1 second. So because now I noticed that when I open the screen, I cannot see you. So please say something if because I cannot see the message. Okay. So because now I
removed myself.
When I open the screen. Okay, thank you. So Brazil, I start with this. This is one of the protests here in Brazil, and you have the anti-prison movement here. We have a long-stand consensus that every prisoner is a political prisoner, that every prison, it is a political prison. So that is what's in the sentence that it is in this picture that you are all seeing. And the reason that we say that is because we understand how prisons are connected with the anti-Black and capitalist system that we have here. So to give you a little bit context, Brazil, it is a majority Black country. We are 54% of the country. And we are also the largest Black country in the Americas and the second largest Black population in the world. We have like about more than 100 million Black people living in Brazil. And police violence and prisons are an intense reality of our population. So we are the third largest carceral population in the world, and every 23 minutes, just to give a data about just young Black men, every 23 minutes, one young Black man is murdered in Brazil. And this data does not count the murder of Black women and people beyond 29 years old, adults in general. So the situation of our prisons are these, what you're saying. The prisons are superpopulated, and torture and the denying access of food, for example, are things quite common in our prisons. For you have an idea, at the beginning of this year, the government published a report about that 50 people in the north of the country had died in prison of a mysterious disease. It was not COVID, it was similar symptoms, but we didn't know what was. So after investigating, after the investigation, was the absence of basic vitamins to survive. So it means that these people, the prisoners are not receiving basic nutrition to be able to survive. And this is a little bit of the reality of Brazilian prisons. Nowadays, we have 166% of superpopulation. And in some states, we have like 200% of superpopulation. This is one of Brazilian's prison cells in a state called Tocantins. And the prisoners, they need to hang, they needed to use toothbrushes to hang these hammocks on the walls and roof. Otherwise, they will not be able to lay down in the same cell to sleep or to rest. They will need to be standing on their foot during the night. This is another picture from this year. So it's also important to say that what I say that these prisons systems are anti-Black and capitalist systems, because the vast majority, some studies are going to say that about 80% of prisoners in Brazil are Black and poor and from urban communities, the favelas that we call here, the shunt towns, the Black poor territories in Brazil. The superpopulation had led to many prison rebellions. This image that we're seeing, it is one of our most famous kind of Attica in Brazil. That was the rebellion called Carandiru, in the prison called Carandiru. In 1992, in the state of São Paulo, there was a prison that was the double of it had about 7,000 prisoners, but it was designed for half of that. So it was kind of the double of prisoners that they was designed for. And they took the control of the prison, and they hanged this here in this picture. You can read, they're saying, "We are grieving, we want justice." And they are trying to negotiate with the government for that the basic human needs and human condition be respected, and especially end torture in prison. That is a reality that we have very strong even nowadays. The prison rebellion Carandiru became known as the Carandiru massacre because of the violence that the state used it to end the rebellion. And I'm gonna show some really strong pictures. So if you are not really comfortable, you can just listen. You don't need to see it. But we keep saying that we need to remember to not repeat these things. And we see our bodies of our brothers and sisters all the times, asking if we're going to be the next on the streets. So unfortunately, this is kind of image that we also use it to see. 111 prisoners were killed after this massacre. These are real pictures of that time. Our bodies were put in these little boxes, and we didn't have a right to a name. They wrote the prisoners didn't have a right to a name. They wrote numbers of the bodies in the numbers in the bodies to identify people. And this is also a real picture after that time, and there are different stories, right? The police says that they needed to act, they were trying to stop the rebellion, and then they needed to protect themselves, and because of that they needed to act with violence. But what we know for sure is that the negotiations with the prisoners were already kind of advanced, and the prisoners had decided to surrender themselves. And after that, the police got in with orders to kill people. So here they are undressing the prisoners and putting them laying down on the floor, while organizing the bodies. So the prisoners were also requested to carry the bodies of those that the police killed. And those who were not killed suffered many violence. This is also a real picture of this prison Carandiru after the massacre. You can see a red liquid in the floor. This is blood. This was, and this, again, this is literally, this is a real picture taken after police action. So even 111 deaths is already a lot, but it's not only those who were killed, it's also all those who were hurt and were tortured and who were spanked and who that were cut and by the police. This is the blood of our brothers and sisters on the floor. I don't want to keep so much on the blood, so I want to bring to this image. Previous rebellions in Brazil have happened since then, since before, but this was the most significant one. But after that, many of them had happened. Having prisoners asking, having demands and trying to negotiate with the government after protected. And at the same time, we were here outside the prisons, claiming for the end of prisons, claiming for, we call this incarceration. There were 3 people from prison. So this is a quite recent protest here in the city where I am, in Belo Horizonte. And in the flyer, in this big flyer, you can see the following phrase: no shooting, no jail, no COVID, no hunger, and fora genocida. That means for the impeachment of Bolsonaro, who we accuse of promoting genocide, anti-Black genocide politics. But it's important to say that both police violence and prison problem in Brazil are not a particularity of this government. You can see that Carandiru happened about 29 years ago. And still this continues. So I'm afraid to go beyond the time, but I just want to say a few more things. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Nowadays we have a particular the type of prison rebellion, and some sociologists and others criminologists, they're gonna kind of blame the prisoners for the deaths inside of these rebellions, because we have drug cartels that run some of these prisons, and sometimes the leadership of one drug cartel is put in a jail or a prison that is controlled by another drug cartel, so we have a kind of war between them. And a few of recent prison rebellions, they didn't have a demand for the government, for example. They are not claiming against torture, they're not claiming about basic rights. They were just a rebellion of fighting between drug cartels. This has been used by some, like I said, some sociologists and some criminologists to say that prison rebellions cannot be considered as a strategy of resistance or something like that, or to blame prisoners for the situation of prisons, to actually claim for more control of the police of these institutions. But what these people don't say is that putting leaderships of one drug cartel in a prison controlled by another drug cartel is a strategy of the government to promote killing inside prisons. So it's not uncommon that we see the judicial system intentionally changing prisoners, knowing about these conflicts between people, to promoting that one group kill the leadership of others, or as a punishment if the leadership made an agreement with one group that it was against the cartels that are more connected with we call militias, the cartels that are connected with the government. And in that sense, for example, in this year, we had 20 leaderships transferred, and was being predicted as being one of the largest killings in terms of prison rebellion in the north of the country. They transferred 20 leaderships of one cartel for another prison. But we also understand that prison rebellion can be the refusal to do what the government wants. So when the prisoners they saw that this was a strategy of the government to promote that we kill each other, they refused to kill and they refused to fight with the leaderships of the other drug cartel. And then these 20 people not only survived it, but it became very clear that they were the policemen that were provoking the fights among them. And so we bring this because it's, of course, you cannot be innocent and say that the prisons rebellions that are connected with some drug cartels, they needed to be looked at with critical eyes. But at the same time, you cannot think that prison rebellions are just when they take the control of the prison. There are any kind of demand made for prisoners for survival, for basic rights, and for the respect of the human dignity. And in that sense, it can occur like occurred in Carandiru, when prisoners did a negotiation with the government, when they took control of the place. But it also can occur when we refuse to play the government game, and you refuse to kill each other, and you refuse to support the militias that run, that is these drug cartels that are close and controlled parts of the government. And in this sense, we continue until nowadays in Brazil fighting both inside the prisons and outside the prisons for disincarceration, for abolitionism, and for the end of racial capitalism. So that's it about Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana, and thank you for sharing these tragic, painful picture, fascinating struggle by Brazilian prisoners. Next, we have Dr. Anthony Ratcliff.
Yes. Oh, great.
The floor is yours.
I appreciate that. So it's great to be here with everybody today. Appreciate the opportunity to rap with y'all about just the prison rebellions and sort of the prisoner movement that's been going on here in the United States. But before I start, I do want to acknowledge that today actually is it would have been the 97th birthday of Amilcar Cabral, who is the leader of the PAIGC, the African Party for Independence in Guinea and Cape Verde. He led that movement, but was assassinated in 1973. And so he's very important because I think the energy, the sort of the spirit of rebellion that permeated most of the time period that I'm going to be focused on, you know, he's someone that really exemplifies that period, right? His movement, his national liberation movement in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, fighting against the Portuguese. And, you know, he's somebody that I think that a lot of the people who I'm looking at and other folks will look at, he inspired those folks, right? And so we always have to acknowledge our ancestors. But I also want to recognize that today, it would have been the third day of the Attica rebellion, right? It was the third day in 1971 when imprisoned radical folks took over the yard and really were trying to make change there. And so I want to share my screen real quick. Hopefully I got this correct. Because I do have some videos or some images that I'd like to share. Oops. Yikes. Let me not. I think I.
So there is a button below the screen that says share. Can you see it?
Yeah.
That's, I think, the one that you need to.
Okay. Let me just do this. Okay, here we go. Ooh. Well, actually, I won't share it. I'll just go through it. I do want to share some images because I think it's important to visualize, and I do appreciate, you know, going after Juliana because I think it's important to see the relationship that these rebellions actually had to each other. The images that were shared of that what happened in Brazil were very similar to the massacre that happened in Attica, right? And so, 1971, September 9th, almost 1,300 prisoners took over the yard there at Attica prison. They had been fighting for years, right, to change the environment there, the conditions there. They were horrible. The people in Attica, the prisoners in Attica, were given one roll of toilet paper a month. They were given one shower a week. They were given 29 cents an hour to work in extremely horrible conditions, right? And so this had gone on for so long, and also the prison was extremely overcrowded. And so a group of prisoners put together a manifesto that called for the ending of these terrible. They demanded that these terrible conditions be ended. But instead of actually changing anything, the administrators, the prison guards, the COs made things worse. And so it was because of that. It was because of the disrespect and the disregard for human life that the people, the men in Attica, decided to take over the yard and really try to make history, right? Try to make change for themselves because they knew that the people that were in control of the prison were not going to do that. And so I think it's important for us to remember that, right? The agency that these imprisoned folks had and the demands that they made and those sort of things, which really are important. And they were really doing this in the context of demands that were going on across the board and in all kinds of different spaces, right? This is the moment of the Black Power movement. And so it's important to remember that. But I do want to sort of think, before I go a little further into that, I want to sort of think about where Attica comes from, right? Attica was not an anomaly. It was not something that just came out of nowhere. It was not something that only happened at one place. This is a time of prison rebellions, right? The 1970s was a very heightened time of prison rebellions. But rebellions have been going on for a long time. And really, it's important to recognize that it's because the system of imprisonment, of prison, creates resistance, right? It's the way that the system is put together. It breeds resistance. And it's really the attempt of the administrators and the prison guards to try to quell that they couldn't stop. And Attica was just that one time where you saw it plainly on the media how poor and how terrible these spaces were, but how when prisoners took the matters into their own hands, they were really able to make some change there, right? But going back, in order for us to really understand where Attica comes from, we do have to go back in history and understand the sort of the foundation of the United States, right? The United States was founded as a settler colony, really instituting a system of chattel slavery. And these sort of things are really what is the foundation of this nation. And it's because of those things that things like the prison were able to come to be. So while enslavement was one form of prison, and actually, I think if we look at enslavement, you see a lot of the ways that the prison system would later come to be were started in enslavement, right? The captivity and all those things. And so once it's really the system, I like to see the system of enslavement as the foundation and the antecedent of the prison industrial complex, right? Africans were captured and forced to march long distances and then put into jail-like systems, right? And into excuse me, I'm all over the place. but really it's that foundation, right? The foundation of the prison systems within the system of enslavement. And then as we see, once enslavement comes to an end and we have the abolition of enslavement, it doesn't end that sort of treatment, right? And if you look at what a lot of prison rebellions and a lot of prisoners talked about in the 1960s and 70s, they liken their experience to being enslaved, right? To being enslaved. And so a lot of them point to the 13th Amendment, right? And the 13th Amendment, as many of us know, the 13th Amendment talked about how it ended slavery except as punishment for a crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. And so the only time that slavery can exist is when people are convicted of a crime. So the prison system became a space that allowed the continuation of slavery. And this was actually spelled out even clearer in a court case Ruffin versus Commonwealth in 1871, which established that a prisoner, as a consequence of his crime, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights, except those which the law and humanity accord him. He is, for the time being, a slave of the state, right? And so this idea of prison and this relationship to enslavement was really codified in early law in the United States. And so as we get to a time when, formal slavery is ended, and then this new type of slavery is born, really the way that this is kind of seen is through the institution of Black codes, right? They're a means of social and labor control. And so as Black codes are passed and people are, African people, Black people who are newly freed are now enslaved in many ways, because if they're seen as being vagrants, if they're seen as not working, not signing contracts, not doing the type of labor that the system wanted them to do, they were thrown back into prison. And it's in that situation that you start to have things like peonage and convict leasing systems, right? And so, there's as this has been pointed out by numerous scholars, right? Michelle Alexander, Angela Davis, others have shown this, right? The relationship between chattel slavery and the prison system. And so as this is going on in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, people are resisting in different ways. There's different ways that folks resisted. You had some rebellions and some strikes and things of that sort throughout the prison system, but it's really after the World War II, right? At the end of the World War II, that you begin to see a clear prisoner movement taking shape in the United States. And it's this more radical movement that's really fomented by the civil rights movement that's going on outside the gates, that begins to inspire prisoners to organize and to really fight for their own behalf, right? And so in the 50s and 60s, you begin to have more and more rebellions, and part of these, many of these are just strikes, people being unwilling to leave their room, not willing to leave the cell, not willing to do the work, sit down strikes, these kind of things. And so this is going on, and actually it's interesting because Vernon Fox talks about how between 1855 and 1955 there were around 400 documented prison rebellions or uprisings. Many of these were very small, right? Many of these were minor, like a couple dozen people organizing, but they were still happening. But between 1960 and 1980, so in a 20-year period, there were over 300 prison rebellions, right? And so Attica takes place in the context of this. And in the 1970s was really the most active time for prison uprisings. And so while Attica, again, is a representative of one of the most extreme and most well-known experiences, it didn't come out of nowhere, as I said, and it wasn't actually the first one. Really, what you see is places like in California, right, with George Jackson and other prison organizers. Rebellions are taking place in smaller ways in these places, right, in the 1960s, and people are refusing to work, and there's also a lot of building of solidarity between prisoners. And that was one thing that I think was really difficult for people to understand, is that prison was attempting to create these differences and really reinstill the differences between prisoners, right, between race, between gender, and all the different things that were instilled in folks. And prison was trying to really codify that and make that something that was impossible to get over. But folks like George Jackson and other prison organizers really began to organize with different folks to try to get beyond that. And so George Jackson was really an inspirational figure because he was, a revolutionary who didn't come into prison as a revolutionary, right? We talk about different types of prisoners. We have, political prisoners who are people who are, because of their political actions, are arrested and put into prison. And that's who a lot of times we focus on. We talk about radical prison organizers. But then you have politicized prisoners, right? People who are politicized within the context of the prison. And so George Jackson is one of those people, politicized when he experiences what he does in the prison system, right? And then you have other prisoners, oftentimes who are called social prisoners, right? And some of them can be politicized and some of them aren't politicized. But at the end of the day, George Jackson was really there trying to organize prisoners. And even though the prison system did what it could throughout the country to segregate and to keep prisoners away from each other and to make it impossible for prisoners to learn from one another, that information, that knowledge got out, right? And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate. People like Dan Berger and Toussaint Louverture talk about the circulation of those ideas, right? The circulation of George Jackson's material that went throughout his prison in Soledad and then in San Quentin, but also throughout all of California and even all the way to the East Coast, right? And so it's that circulation of ideas which is very important for this organization of the prison movement, and then these rebellions to kick off. And so, while one thing that really is important too is, so Attica is not, again, an anomaly. Attica is not an isolated event, and it actually has a clear trajectory, right? And so, first of all, there was a prison rebellion that happened a year earlier in July 1970 in Auburn, New York, right, which is not too far from Attica. Hundreds of prisoners took over the yard. They held about 40 hostages, right? They got 40 guards and other people and held them hostage. This lasted for only one day, though, right? But it was really their attempt to sort of raise the issue of what had been going on to prisoners, the mistreatment that they experienced, the poor food and all the different things. And so they attempted to really, raise this up through this rebellion. It was put down pretty quickly. And at that point, which was a year before Attica took place, there was an attempt by the commissioner of prisons in New York to try to make some change, but nothing really happened, right? Not long after that, later that year, actually the next month, in August of 1970, you have the Tombs Rebellion, which is in New York City, right? New York City, numerous different prisons in New York, or jails actually in New York, all experienced rebellions. And these rebellions were, folks for the same sort of thing, overcrowding of the prison, for the mistreatment of prisoners, for, they were not allowed to express any political beliefs. And at this time in Tombs prison, you had a number of Black Panthers. And so this is all going on. And what's happening is this information, it's not, the prisoners aren't able to, prisoners in Attica didn't automatically hear this, but what happened was that prisoners from both Auburn and Tombs got sent to Attica, right? And so as they get sent to Attica, they begin to organize there. They initially were kept segregated. Once they got out of segregation, they began to organize there and begin to educate the prisoners about, the problem with the conditions on the yard. And so later in July of 1971, you have a group of Attica prisoners called the Attica Liberation Faction, which released a list of demands. And these lists of demands were very clearly articulating, recognizing the fact that the Attica imprisoned folks they saw themselves as workers, right? They defined what they were doing as creating a wealth for the state of New York. And so they believed that they should be paid more. And they also were demanding the formation of unions and different types of things, and just also for the better treatment of prisoners in Attica. And so they initially released their list of demands, and the prison guards pretty much ignored them. There was a moment when a new prison commissioner named Oswald began to, at least act like he heard what they were saying and recognized that their demands were talked about. They want to do this democratically. They weren't trying to, call a strike or anything. So Oswald heard that, and he was, acting like he cared and he was going to actually make some changes. But, as most prison administrators are, they were lying to the people, right? There was really no change to be had. And so these demands, really were there, and folks were not willing to just let go. And so this was released in July 1971, and in August 1971, George Jackson was assassinated by the guards in San Quentin. And that was a really turning point, right, for the movement in Attica. It was the moment when folks in Attica, the organizers who had been trying to bring together the different factions on the yard, right? There were numerous different factions. You had Black nationalists, you had Black Muslims, you had Black Panthers, you had the Young Lords, a Puerto Rican liberation organization. You had radical white folks, and they were trying to bring those folks together. And it was after the assassination of George Jackson on August 21st, 1971, that really began to bring these folks together. And so the day after he was killed on August 22nd, a group of prisoners from Attica got together and held a silent protest. They all wore black armbands. They all refused to talk and they refused to eat that day. And that showed themselves that they actually could organize and be in solidarity, but also put some fear into the hearts of the prison guards, right? They recognized that there was something going on. Folks have been organizing, and they should do something. But the administrators, the folks at the top of the prison hierarchy, decided to do very little. And so things were still simmering, and there was this anger, frustration, and rage that was there that the prisoners really were feeling. And so on September 8th, two prisoners were in the yard. They were, jostling about, making it look like they were kind of, slap boxing, not really fighting. But the guards thought they were fighting. The guards went there to sort of try to stop it. A fight ensued between one of the prisoners and the guard, and then those prisoners were arrested or were taken into and put into the hole, and that really sparked more anger from the masses of prisoners who saw this and saw the attack that happened. One of the guards ended up hitting one of the black prisoners in the head, Leroy Dewar, and that really set off anger. And so the following day, as they were attempting to go take another prisoner out of his cell to put him into the hole, that's when Attica kicked off. And so, Attica really was an interesting and an important moment because, again, it showed that the prisoners who had been, trying to demand change, peacefully, quote unquote, trying to work within the quote unquote system, and they were having very little support from the powers that be, because they recognized, the prison system was not about that. The prison system was created to sort of make people feel like they were not human, right? To treat people inhumanely. And so they took over the yard, and for 4 days, they held Attica prison, and they were able to sort of really show the world both how poorly they had been treated, but also how strong they were, right? And I think one of the things that I really am taken and inspired by is, even though the initial rebellion that started, it was a time of there was a lot of stuff going on, right? It was a little chaotic. There was people getting a little bit of retribution going on in the yard. There was a lot of stuff happening that really wasn't in line with a rebellion, an organized rebellion turned into a revolutionary moment. But the next, later that day, folks recognized that, and they began to organize amongst themselves. And sort of the thing that I'm really taken and really inspired by is the way that they organized sort of both mutual aid, solidarity networks within the yard, right? They organized food distribution. They organized a medic center, right? Just like when we look at, today, when you look at things like after the George Floyd uprising, in places like Seattle, you had the autonomous zone, right? Where they had food set up, they had medical centers. They did the same thing in Attica, right? And that's something that we really don't hear a lot about, right? Is the way that the prisoners organize themselves. And they really were able to sort of demonstrate the fact that this prison system was not really necessary. They were able to sort of control and take care of themselves without the input of the guards, right? And they had a better organized space and a more, peaceful space than when the guards were running things, right? People weren't fighting each other. And so this is really an inspirational moment, right? And I think that while the end of it ended in a massacre, and I think one thing that we could see, and what I'm always taken aback by, is the way that the governor of New York, Rockefeller, decided just to come in there with full force and to kill 40 people, 10 of them being the guards that were held hostage, was really because Nixon and other folks had told him that you can't show any weakness. You can't allow these black radicals, as he called them, to make it seem like what they're doing is legitimate. It's the same sort of thing that happened when Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson's brother, went into the Marin County courthouse and took it over. When the police came and Jonathan Jackson had taken 2 or 3 different hostages, the judge and other people, the police decided just to kill everybody rather than to let them get away, because it was a bad example, right? They did the same thing with Attica. And so, even though Attica, they thought that by putting it down, by quelling it, they could sort of make it look like that sort of thing was not possible. After Attica, numerous other rebellions took place, right? Hundreds of other rebellions took place in response to what happened at Attica. And really, that was an important moment, right? The 1970s, as I said, was the highest moment of prison organizing and prison rebellion in the United States. But I think one thing that I'm really left with, and I kind of remember, is 1973 is when Norman Rockefeller passed the drug, right? He passed the medical, or the marijuana, or he saw drugs were going to be seen as mandatory minimums. Excuse me, I'm kind of all over the place, but yeah, the mandatory minimums of drugs, right? And this is really the beginning of mass incarceration. And so even though Attica was a time when you see prisoners attempting to assert, and to demand rights and to really get onto the world stage and not take any mess and organize for themselves, this introduction of the war on drugs and on mass incarceration really kind of undercut that. And so by the 1980s, a lot of the prison organizing had kind of fallen by the wayside, but you still had seeds of that with groups like the Black Guerrilla Army, right? And Black August, that was organizing in places like California, and that sort of kept the seeds going. And so I'm still hopeful, because we've seen recently that prison rebellions are still taking place, that prisoners are still organizing, right? Starting in 2013, you had prisoners in California that had serious hunger strikes. In 2016, you had a massive prison strike that happened, throughout the United States. And so there's still that seed of rebellion is still there. And I think it's imperative for us on the outside, right? On the outside, to connect ourselves to that, right? To see that that the prison is, it is affecting us. And I'm going to leave with this. I want to leave with L.D. Barkley, who was one of the organizers and one of the spokespeople at Attica, and what he said. He says, the entire incident that has erupted here at Attica is not a result of the dastardly bushwhacking of the two prisoners September 8, 1971, but of the unmitigated oppression wrought by the racist administrative network of this prison throughout the year. We are men, we are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. The entire prison populace, that means each and every one of us here, has set forth to change forever the ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners here and throughout the United States. What has happened here is but the sound before the fury of those who are oppressed. We will not compromise on any terms except those terms that are agreeable to us. We've called upon all the conscientious citizens of America to assist us in putting an end to the situation that threatens the lives of not only us, but of each and every one of you as well. We have set forth demands that will bring us closer to the reality of the demise of these prison institutions that serve no useful purpose to the American people, but to those who would enslave and exploit the people of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you for making those connection with the long racial history in the U.S. and also for talking about the circulation of knowledge and bringing George Jackson into Attica and his important impact on the prisoners there. Finally, last but not least, Milena from Palestine with some wonderful news from a few days ago with the escape. So let's hear from you. Thank you.
Sorry, I think I was on mute. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for organizing this event and panel of esteemed speakers. It's a privilege and an honor for me to hear from both of the speakers and to know more about what's happening as well. It only shows how there is so many intersecting struggles between the whole systems, whether it's in the US or Brazil or even Palestine. Before I begin speaking about the prison system and how it is with regards to the Palestinian people, I think it's important to give a bit of background and context to the Israeli occupation on Palestine. So it would help a bit understand how Palestinians end up in Israeli prisons. And just to begin, a bit of statistics and numbers, and this is important because when I say the numbers, please all bear in mind that these are not only numbers. Each number represents a Palestinian mother or a child or a man or a woman or an elderly, whether it's a political figure or a simple student or anything. So when we talk about numbers, we're as all prisons, we don't talk about just numbers. We talk about human beings who are deprived from their liberty. So by the end of 2020, the number of Palestinian prisoners incarcerated in Israeli prisons was around 4,400. This included 170 children and 41 women, including 380 administrative detainees. And administrative detainees are those who are held in detention without any basis. So there are secret information and no trial. So this is one form of political prisoners as well. There were also 700 ill prisoners and 26 prisoners who were incarcerated since before Oslo, so since before 1993. Currently, there are 4,670 Palestinian prisoners, including 200 children and 40 women. 520 are under administrative detention. Also, there are 7 withheld bodies of Palestinian prisoners who passed away inside prison due to deliberate medical negligence by the Israeli prison services. These are just a few statistics and numbers to give you the overview. So over 72 years, Israel, as the occupying power, has established a full apartheid apparatus to suppress, control, and maintain its power against the Palestinian people and delegitimize them. As I think it was Anthony who mentioned the right of self-determination when we talk about the abolition of prisons. And I truly believe this is where the Palestinian context is very highlighted, where when we talk about abolishing Israeli prisons, we don't only talk about the prisons themselves, we talk about the whole apartheid regime. We cannot advocate and argue for the end of Israeli prisons without the end of the root cause of these prisons, or the root aim, which is the Israeli occupation regime and apartheid regime. So the military regime in the occupied Palestinian territory exercises legislative, executive, and judicial powers that have been a forceful tool in carrying out the Israeli occupation's racist and unjust policies against the Palestinian people. So as part of this apparatus, the Israeli military courts prosecute Palestinian civilians based on Israeli military orders that are issued by the Israeli military commander. These military orders have criminalized all aspects of a Palestinian's life, whether it is civil rights, for example, student activities or assembly or unions for Palestinians, whether it is political rights. So military orders have criminalized the right to self-determination for the Palestinian people, the right to practice political activities, as many of the Palestinian, so there are now 11 Palestinian Legislative Council members in prison for their mere practicing and exercising political rights, which is a right protected under and enshrined under international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. So with this brief and context to how Palestinians end up in prison, you'd understand that it is a collective system, whether it is from the courts or the Israeli occupation forces. It is a collective open prison that the Palestinian people are living in. So just to continue on with the Israeli military courts and how Palestinians are prosecuted, within the framework of Israeli military courts, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians are tried and convicted with disproportionate prison sentences and excessive fines, which further burden the detainees and their families. This is, of course, notwithstanding the brutal detention conditions that they are subjected to inside prison. So Israeli prisons play an integral role in sustaining and feeding into the primary goal of establishing a comprehensive Israeli apartheid regime. So with that in mind, we ask ourselves, who are Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons? They are literally all the Palestinian people. As I mentioned, there are children in prison. And as we know, under international law, the deprivation of liberty for children should come as a last resort, but we don't see this happening at all in Israeli military courts, where Palestinian children are still perceived as people who simply voice their people who threaten the security of the occupying power of Israel. And this is where we understand that Israeli prisons are used to maintain control over Palestinians. We have cases of Palestinian children. I can tell you a case of a child prisoner. His name was Amal Nakhle. He's still incarcerated in Israeli prisons as we speak now. Amal Nakhle suffers from a medical condition, so his health is reported by medical staff that he faces medical implications that need supervision, constant supervision, and medical checkup constantly. Amal Nakhle, there was an administrative detention order against him, where Israel is saying that this child with medical health conditions is a risk to the Israeli occupation and security of Israel, and now he's been detained without charges and no fair trial against him. When Al-Damir, as the legal representatives of the child detainee, when we try to argue in court against the military prosecutor, we don't have any information. They are secret information under administrative detention, so we don't even know what to argue and how to argue. But the aim and goal is to imprison Palestinians who oppose the occupation in any way. I talked about children in a sense, just to give you an idea that there is absolutely no legitimate excuse to why Palestinians are being placed inside Israeli prison, but the sole purpose to silence them, control, and maintain an apartheid regime on them. And a similar example to prisoners and how prisons, the main goal of them is to actually deprive and belittle and control people, is we have so many students inside prison where their only affiliation to a student group that works not for political activities, but that does, for example, we had a list of charges that said one of the students who is being allegedly prosecuted, who's being prosecuted in a military court, the list of charges for her included visiting an elderly home within the student union council. So just to give you an idea how Palestinians reach prison, it's all part of the controlling system, and prisons is also an integral part of it. So this is before prisons. So when Palestinians are held inside prisons, I do not need to tell you about the harsh and the harsh ill treatment inside prison. You can only imagine the deliberate medical negligence inside women prisoners. There is no specified gynecologist for Palestinian women prisoners inside prison. There is a clear lack of hygiene products that are being provided for prisoners, and we have seen the lack of deliberate medical negligence during the outbreak of the corona pandemic, where Palestinian prisoners were not seen as people who should be protected against the outbreak of the pandemic. They were barely provided with hygienic products. They were not, the Israeli prison services did not implement any social distancing between not social distancing, but Israeli prisons suffer from overcrowding inside prisons. So there were no amendments in the policies of the prisons during the pandemic. Prisoners who were affected with COVID were directly put in solitary confinement alone without any proper health supervision or monitoring. And this is extremely problematic because even in a pandemic, Israeli prisons do not properly treat Palestinian prisoners. This is with regard to health in a way. When we also want to talk about how Israeli prisons economically exploit Palestinian prisoners, this could be seen in the history of the Palestinian prisoners inside Israeli prisons, as in the beginning, the Red Cross, they were in charge of providing the necessarily food for the prisoners. But later on, the Israeli prison services established the canteen idea, where prisoners are not allowed anything from outside prison, but are forced to buy from the canteens inside prison. And this is problematic because the prices in the canteens are extremely high, indicating a form of exploitation of these prisoners. In the past, also towards 2004, there was a huge hunger strike, a collective hunger strike by the Palestinian prisoners movement against forcing prisoners to work without getting even payment as an alternative to their work. But this with the movement of the Palestinian prisoners, with the hunger strike, they completely changed the system, whereas now they do not work in an indirect way and do not get paid for it. Just to slowly move on to not only economic exploitation, but also we see how Israeli prisons are discriminatory in a nature, where you see Palestinian prisoners being treated in a very different way with regards to policies, how Israeli prisons are treated. And please don't get me wrong, we in no way argue that we need equal rights as the Israelis, or our fight is not to be equal as our occupying power. This is not what we ask for. Our fight is for us as a Palestinian people to have our right of self-determination, to choose our political, economic, and social affairs the way it is. And this is what prisoners also want. There is no official organized education in prison. Prisoners have fought themselves to get an educational system inside prison that is followed by like a Palestinian academic educational system. Israel does not provide a proper educational system for Palestinian prisoners held inside Israeli prisons. Family visitation differ from whether you are a Palestinian prisoner or an Israeli prisoners. And when I tell you Palestinian prisoners, people might argue that because we are an occupying we're an occupying people, we do not get rights as prisoners. But this is completely against international humanitarian law, which says that prisoners from the occupied power are entitled to the fundamental rights such as education, proper medical health care, and good conditions of detention. We also talk about when I mentioned family visits, there are no family visits, for example, open family visits for those Palestinians who are listed as security inmates. And let me tell you, security inmates is not that someone did a military action and they are convicted as security inmates. Security inmates could be absolutely anyone. We have the Palestinian Legislative Council member, Khalida Jarrar, a female Legislative Council member. She is enlisted as a security inmate, although her list of charges did not have any military activities or any affiliation to any military group. Her list of charges was completely focusing on her role as a political figure, but yet she is identified as a security prisoner. And this is problematic because security prisoners have limited and restricted rights. Just to give you an idea, the Khalida Jarrar's youngest daughter, passed away while she was imprisoned. So our organization, as we represent Khalida Jarrar, the Palestinian prisoner, the PLC Palestinian prisoner, we requested that the Israeli Prison Services release Khalida Jarrar for humanitarian intervention, only to attend her youngest daughter's funeral. However, she was denied access. She was denied this right because the Israeli Prison Service say that Khalida is a security inmate and she poses threat to the security of Israel. And this is when we understand that prisons are not in any way a form of rehabilitation or a form of protecting Israel's security. But on the other hand, it's a form to suppress Palestinians. It's a form to imply psychological and physical torture on them in order to basically silence any opposition against the Israeli occupation. Before just a few things before I wrap up, I do want to talk about hunger strikes as a form of rebelliousness and what Palestinian prisoners have been using. So hunger strikes define disciplinary power of control and domination. The body of the hunger striker constitutes a medium in which power is shifted and recreated. Palestinian prisoners and detainees refuse to comply with the prison structure of constraint, where they do not have any autonomy over their own bodies. So through hunger strikes, the prisoners regain sovereignty over their bodies through becoming decision makers over the prison authorities. Currently, there are 6 Palestinian prisoners under administrative detention. There are 6 Palestinian prisoners who are under hunger strike, protesting their administrative detention. The history of Palestinian hunger strikes in mass and individual reveals the lack of trust in the judicial system, the Israeli judicial system, and the lack of fair trial guarantees that they face within the Israeli military and civil court system. Palestinian prisoners resorted to hunger strikes as early as 1968 as a legitimate and peaceful way to protest the Israeli detention policies and cruel detention treatment. And when we talk about cruel and ill treatment policies by the Israeli prison services, as I mentioned, it's deliberate medical negligence, it's solitary confinement, denial of family visits, degrading treatment, inadequate living standards inside the prison cells themselves. So in the beginning, it was against these policies, but later on, towards the 1990s, Palestinian prisoners resorted to hunger strikes as a form to protest their administrative detention as well, and not only the cruel and degrading treatment inside prison. Just briefly, in response to hunger strikes, the Israeli occupying power practiced forced feeding of Palestinian prisoners under hunger strikes. At some point, the Israeli courts banned the use of force feeding because several Palestinian prisoners died due to force feeding because of the Israeli occupation placed the tube insertion of the feeding tube in their lungs instead of their stomach. Sorry, Yasser, I can sense that my time is
no, go ahead. You have 1 or 2 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So with the 1 and 2 minutes, I will talk about what I like to call, and I would like people to start calling it, and that's why I call it the Great Escape. So as I'm not sure if we all are aware or not, but on the 6th of September 2021, in the early hours of the morning, 6 Palestinian prisoners escaped from the high security Israeli prison, Galboa prison, through an underground tunnel. From the 6 escapees, there were 3 who are classified as maximum security prisoners, and 4 who were serving life sentences, and the other 2 were still awaiting trial before an Israeli military court. It should be noted that one of the prisoners attempted to escape in 2014, and as a punitive and arbitrary measure against his failed attempt, he was put in solitary confinement for a whole year. So immediately after the prison break, the Israeli prison services instituted a series of collective, punitive, and arbitrary measures against all Palestinian prisoners. So we're talking about around 4,700 Palestinian prisoners. This included the complete lockdown of all prisons, banning outside access, complete outside access to the prisoners. And our organizations expressed grave concern regarding the initiation of a series of collective and arbitrary measures, because the Israeli occupation is known for their retaliatory measures that are extremely exaggerated and disproportionate to the situation at hand. So other than the complete lockdown of all prisons, especially Galboa prison, the Israeli prison services, so the escapees prisoners are allegedly to be affiliated to the Islamic Jihad movement. So the Islamic Jihad, all prisoners that are allegedly affiliated to the Islamic Jihad, regardless in what Israeli prison they are, they were transferred and moved. So the movement was how prisons are in Israel. So it's according to the group you are affiliated to, you are sectioned in prison. And this is also part of how prisons maintain control, how prisoners, for example, who are Fatah affiliated are all together. So after the escape, the Great Escape, the Israeli prison services dismantled the Islamic Jihad across all the Israeli prisons, having one Islamic Jihad member in a prison cell with others. Notwithstanding, they reduced the free time for prisoners to from 8 hours to 2 hours. In the retaliatory measures, and the problem here comes when we talk about retaliatory measures against prisoners who are already inside prison and already facing retaliatory measures. So it's an exaggerated measures against them. Prisoners in Ofar prison, when they heard that Israel would forcibly transfer prisoners, they refused the transfer of prisoners outside prison to unknown located areas, and they threatened to burn their own prison rooms. In a Naqab prison, rooms were actually burnt. And when we talk about prisoners burning their own rooms, we should not take this lightly at all. Prisoners inside the rooms have all their personal belongings, whether it's their family photos or their basic necessities that they barely have. So their own clothes, their everything. So when prisoners rebel in a way and burn their own rooms, this means that they have reached a final resort where the incarceration policies, whatever they are being subjected to, they cannot handle it anymore. So and later on now, 2 days ago on Friday and Saturday, 4 escapees were captured by the Israeli prison, by the Israeli occupation forces. And our grave concern even increases because the Israeli occupation authorities, the Israeli intelligence, are known, and this is documented facts from our organization, that they use torture techniques and ill treatment in order to either extract information or in order to retaliate against the escapees. So at this point, we do express grave concern for ill treatment and use of torture against the captured detainees after their escape. I hope I didn't take much of your time, and please feel free to ask any questions regarding anything that wasn't clear. Thank you.
Thank you for such an inspiring talk and a very thorough anatomy of Israeli prisons. It's painful, but yet inspiring. Let me bring back Anthony and Juliana. And part of what we do with the GPAC, the Global Prison Abolitionist Coalition, is to examine the connections and the kind of conversation, the transmission or circulation of knowledge that Anthony was referring to earlier, and see if abolitionist movements in different locations in the world can talk to each other, inspire each other, learn from each other. So I wanted to give you a few minutes each if you would like to comment on each other's talk or ask questions or any remarks you may have. Anyone, or we can jump to the questions if.
Yeah, one thing,
please.
I'm really recognizing is the relationship. I think Milena, you talked about the hunger strike, right? And I think that's something that, while it was not something, it was something that was used earlier, like in the 70s when the rebellion was going on, but I think it's used more now because so many prisoners, right, are kept in shoes, right, the solitary confinement housing units, and the fact that they have they're locked down 23 hours a day. They have no interaction with other people. So there's not the ability to really collectivize, right? To come together collectively, right? And so that idea of the hunger strike is the only way that they have any ability to sort of assert agency in that moment. I think that's so important because, there's a tendency to look at that as fatalist or whatever. But I think that is the one thing that people have, that they can still assert some sort of agency in this situation where they are pretty much isolated for anybody else, right? And I think that's a very important point. I like that. I really thought a lot about that as I thought about where the prison movement has moved into the 21st century in the United States.
Yeah, and we always talk about hunger strikes either in individual and in mass. We have realized that individual hunger strikes have not had a greater success when prisoners do it individually. But we've talked to many prisoners who got on hunger strikes, and we really asked them, how can you? And as you mentioned, because they have absolutely no other way to protest what is happening to them but to use their own bodies. And this is what we see in burning rooms. There is absolutely nothing. They cannot fight the Israeli prison guards, or they cannot physically, it's the last resort that the detainees always end up to, and it's not easy to go into hunger strike. It's not easy to burn your own room. So when we talk about six Palestinian prisoners under hunger strike, people say, yeah, 6, it's okay. In a few weeks they won't be on hunger strike. But the gravity of even one hunger striking detainee is important. And just to talk about the intersecting struggles, and I didn't hear about it a lot, but I do know that the economic, I don't know, but there is economic exploitation in the US for prisoners. Is that in Brazil as well, or it's more humanitarian and political in Brazil? There's no economic exploitation as well.
I don't know if I can say that it's a humanitarian thing. Like we don't have we have a few private prisons, but it's not in the number in the US. So most of our prisons, they are public. But here actually one of the things that we're doing is a campaign for the right to work, because this is something that is ensured by the Constitution. But like I said, so one thing that you need to be, I think that I need to explain a little bit better, it's what a militia is. Because here we have areas that are controlled by drug cartels, right? But people usually think that the state is fighting against these drug cartels, but you have inside, we have a militarized police since the dictatorship, the military dictatorship that you had about 30 years ago. And inside of this militarized police, we have groups organized to kill, we call extermination groups. I don't know how to say in English, grupos de extermínio. Sorry, I hope it be clear. Anyway, kind of fascist groups organized to kill other people. And they are really connected with drug cartels. These groups are what we call militias. So when the state, for example, is changing people or is denying their right to work, it's through militias. They are doing to make the militias access and control more territory in the country. So in some states, for people who have to work, they were requiring, like the state was requiring that the prisoner ask for a lawyer, but it was a lawyer and make a lawyer make a document to do it. But the lawyer that was imposed was a lawyer of the militia. So they were using that to take money. So they take money from the prisoners to feed the militias. Because of this, it's actually contractor. So Anthony was talking about all the radical mobilization in the US. In Carandiru, we have a lot of radical mobilization, but it was not organized theoretically in that sense. But one of the biggest drug cartels nowadays that is called PCC, we really don't know how it started, but one of the stories that we heard about they started, it was after this massacre of Carandiru, the prisoners organized themselves. It's a drug cartel, but it's also a drug cartel that protects prisoners' rights in that sense. So, and it's one of the groups that the militias want to end. And it's very complex because you cannot say they're still capitalist companies in that sense that they're very patriarchal. They have their own form of justice that sometimes the left groups, they are like very against. I already had lost many comrades for drug cartels, but at the same time, they're the ones who started to help to mobilize communities when you were during the pandemic, and the ones who fight against torture when you are on the streets, also fighting against torture. So it's not everything like so black and white in that sense, you know. And we don't have this. We have this economic exploitation, but in terms, for example, when the militias are using money, requiring people to hire lawyers from the militias, but not in the sense of, it's not big in the sense of economic work. Actually, people are banished to work many times. And I feel that the economic exploitation also happens, especially for the families of the prisoners. So if you look for the anti-prison movements in Brazil, we are majority Black women and from favelas fighting for our sons, our fathers, our neighbors, our friends that are in jail, and for male partners, but also female, but the majority are male members. And we're the ones that are like taking tampons to give for the women's prison because they don't have access to tampons. We're the ones who have to pay the lawyers. We're the ones who have to go and give like the minimum conditions for survival of our own. So we're the ones who are giving food and helping food to enter the prison. So what happens that, for example, especially during the COVID now, we were more poor because of the pandemic and economic crisis. So our people were dying in prisons. So in that sense, there is also this economic exploitation that if you think of how much the state, because the state denies the basic rights to people, and you need to mobilize, even without conditions to survive outside, you need to mobilize to make them survive inside, you know, and then the state free itself from give basic things like hygienic items. You know, this is not a cost in that sense. It's another form to economic exploitation. But yeah, so it's a little bit different than in the US, but it still happens.
Thank you all. So we have a question from Swati Birla for Milena, and the question is about, can you help us think about abolition from the perspective of these young prisoners? And I think what she's referring to is the resistance of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners. What impact does it have on the younger prisoners, and what is the role or involvement, if they have any at all?
So with regards to the role or the effect of how the rebellion, the adults, prisoners have, how it impacts the younger prisoners, I think at some point, you know, because the child Palestinian prisoners are put in a different prison as the adults prisoners. But I do think now, for example, with the Great Escape that has happened, it does impact the younger prisoners to actually understand the power of what's happening, the power of patience and whatnot. But from a perspective of the younger prisoners, I do think they have reached a point where the prison itself did actually control and maintain them to silence them. The thing is, because the Palestinian children are really, they don't have any way to exercise any form of speaking up against the occupation. If a child, and I say a child who's under 17 years old, throws a rock, a simple rock, the sentence against him or her is, or them, the sentence against them is 10 years in prison, 10 years. And if that rock did an injury again or harmed a moving vehicle, or a vehicle, not a person, that sentence is 20 years. So I think at this point, the younger Palestinian generation is afraid of prisons. They do not want to go into Israeli prisons. They are willing to for example, take plea bargain and say that they are guilty in order to lessen their sentence, in order to stay away as possible from prisons. And us Palestinians, we are trying as much as we can to not even get children inside prison. So what we aim for is not to how we want to see the younger prisoners work on abolition against prisons. No, we don't want that at all, to be honest. We want 0 children in Israeli prisons, as it should be. So maybe I did not answer your question, but part of me doesn't want to answer your question because I don't want the 17-year-old and less Palestinian people to be fighting and doing hunger strikes and escaping prison and being subjected to ill treatment inside prison. I don't want them to exist inside these prisons at all. So in order to help the younger generation with this question, we should put responsibility on us ourselves to take the abolition idea on extreme and make it happen before we have to ask our younger generation to work on it themselves, in a way.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, the state violence in Israel is terrifying. I mean, what you are recounting here is just traumatizing, but also the Palestinian movement and organizing around prisons. I think we have a lot to learn from Palestinian, because there is a long-standing organizing around those issues. And I think that recently, with the Black movement in the US and elsewhere, has been establishing those connections and visits and discussion and debate among each other. We have another question here for Anthony. Anthony defined the system of slavery as the foundation of prison system in the US. Similarly, Milena talks about the need to understand prison in the larger system of colonization in Palestine. How central are prisons to these systems of racial capitalism, colonization, and how central is prison abolition to the destruction of these systems?
Yeah, I think looking at the history of U.S. prisons and sort of how the prisons developed, I think that they're essential for the development of racial capitalism in the United States, right? We look at the different processes, whether you look at settler colonialism, right, as the first kind of incursion on this land that the European settlers did. That there's a form of prison, of punishment and social control that's going on there, right? Especially when indigenous people are taken and put onto reservations, like those become prisons themselves, right? But specifically with chattel slavery, I think that there's both, the fact that the chattel slavery was first and foremost an economic motive, right? It was economic. It was a sort of way in which Europeans could sort of produce things or have things produced, because they weren't the ones doing the production, right? Have goods and things produced to kind of help create the system of capitalism, racial capitalism. And so that chattel slavery is part and parcel. Without that, I don't think that the United States would have been able to develop as an economic system that it currently has. But I think that the prison, the captivity, carcerality, all those things that are sort of central to what we've been talking about, were all began at those moments, right? Both with settler colonialism, you see the ways that different, military soldiers and the way that they sort of arrested or kidnapped or controlled indigenous people, putting them in different sort of prisons type. They weren't called prisons at the times, right? I think the first prison was like 1790 in the United States. But I think that there's definitely, you see the punishment in the way that kind of prisons come out of the process of settler colonialism in the United States. But also, specifically, as I said, with chattel slavery, that sort of whole motive, that whole process is what really helped develop racial capitalism, right? And so I see those things as, without enslavement, you wouldn't have had racial capitalism. But I think the idea of captivity and punishment and all those things that come along with enslavement that kind of developed into the system of prisons that we have today, those are all essential for the development. And people talk, you look at it from a Marxist perspective, they talk about surplus labor, like what happens with all the surplus labor, where do you put them? And so those folks go to prison. So I definitely think that those things are part and parcel to the system of racial capitalism.
If I may add something, because the history of Brazil and the United States is very similar on this. So for those who don't know Brazil, we also like I said at the beginning of my presentation, we're actually the largest plantation system in Americas and the largest slavery. So Anthony, when he resumes US system, he also talks a lot about how Brazil operates. So I just wanted to add that beyond two things. One, beyond of how slavery and prisons contributed to the economic system and to the formation of racial capitalism, it's also nowadays a source of a market by itself. And even though here in Brazil, for example, we have public public prisons, we don't have a lot of private prisons. You have a whole economy that is based on the militarized police, that is based on the fear, politicians that work through agendas, so the fear of other people, making us fear other people, and for example, the recent president, he actually won the election saying that he would kill criminals because people need to be free of criminals. You have all the economy that is circulates about in terms of guns, that is also very strong and very important. So the whole judicial system, like I said, even from the lawyers and the judges, everything, you have a whole system, economic system that is based on the death of imprisonment and death of those who are of Black and poor people. And I didn't talk about SWAT, ask about adult narratives, but in Brazil, the prison is very much a young narrative because we don't have the chance to grow older. We are usually killed before that. If you look at our demographic, you see that there is a hole in our demographic graphics on Black youth because of how much we're killed. There's a demographic hole in the sense that we are disappearing, in the sense that how much we're being killed. And beyond this economic system, we also have the need to control people through what maybe the boys would call the psychological age, right? Like, oh, I may be poor, I may be exploited, but at least I'm not Black. In Brazil, this is not translated in these terms. In Brazil, this is translated through the idea of citizens, good citizens. So, like, but it is a racial category, but the term, how race works in Brazil, racism operates a little bit different. So it's also a way to make legit the system of oppression, because people would say, oh, I right now, I'm here like in the neighborhood that I live, it is kind of a shutdown. And you have people saying, oh, when the militarized police come and shooting people, they are looking for criminals, but I'm a good citizen. So I'm going to vote for those who enforce this politics because, and people keep saying that until until they be shot and they, oh shit, the police, there is no this division. This division is a lie. But this division is necessary to keep somehow to a discourse that is going to legitimize the system in that sense. So one of the things that you do to break, because one of the reasons that you say every criminal is a political criminal is to say, hey, it's not because somebody is selling weed or somebody still something or somebody, even we have to rethink what murder is. And I want to say, like, when you live and you grow up in a place that you're having people being killed every time by the police, the youth see their life in a way that is very different to what it's on TV, you know? And we were trying to rethink, hey, if you keep saying like that, the police or the prison, they're gonna just be the others, they're not gonna be you. You're not gonna understand that you are exploited for the same system that are using them just like a scapegoat. So we also understand like that is central, this discourse is central to sustain racial capitalism here. So we need to break with it.
Thank you. The next question is related to the question of racial capitalism. How can we understand racial capitalism as a global system, and how does it manifest itself differently in different places, and how can we build effective horizontal solidarity despite the differences? And I think this is referring again to on the one hand, a racial capitalism that is quite complex and that operate in different ways and has different strategies in different places. And so the question is, how do we build solidarity, connections, intersections, despite those differences? I mean, the question of, as Anthony, you mentioned, the question of the genocidal settler colonialism that is the history of the US is not necessarily transposable to Europe or to other places who have maybe other historical trajectories. And yet there is this global system that is operating. So what are your thoughts? Who would like to answer that question?
Well, I think, I mean, the system of racial capitalism, as Cedric Robinson talks about, right, is sort of the fact that racism and capitalism are interlinked, right? And so we kind of understand that is, and it's a global system. And even, I think the thing that really I'm thinking about is the solidarity aspect of it, right? How do we actually challenge that? And when I'm thinking about hearing the discussions that the other folks have had here, you know, the struggle that happens in the United States is the way that this prison becomes a space of like hyper racialization, right? Where folks come into the prison, especially today, like it started early on, but I think today they've kind of, the system itself has mastered it, where people are so hyper racialized, that, you know, you got Black folks here, you got Latinx people here, you got white folks here, you got third world people over here, you know, and sometimes not knowing where to go. The struggle is, how do those folks in that context even come together, right? I think that's, you know, one thing we've seen, that's been a struggle that's happened post this, you know, post the rebellious 1970s. It's been harder and harder to bring those folks together. Some of the more recent rebellions that have happened in prisons have been racialized, right? So it's like Black folks fighting Latinx folks, but even like within, like a major one that happened that actually sparked another rebellion of sorts happened in South Carolina, where like Black folks fought each other, different gangs fought each other, and it was people got murdered and all kinds of people died, and that actually sparked a strike within the prison. So I think that's the difficulty. How do we, you know, build solidarity on those levels, but also how do we understand the struggles that are going on internationally? I think that's, you know, you get a lot of prisoners. I think one thing that you know, looking at the time period I was really interested in the 1970s, a lot of the prisoners saw themselves kind of in the same boat as what was going on in Vietnam, right? They saw themselves as kind of having relationships with the Vietnamese, because they recognized that the Vietnamese were sort of fighting a war against the United States, or trying to defend themselves, right, against the United States imperialism. And so they saw themselves having many similarities with that. But also there's a lot of evidence of, you know, they saw the PLO as a group that a lot of them talked about the PLO as being groups they had solidarity with. You know, the African diaspora was very important. So people in Brazil, elsewhere are definitely discussed. You look at a lot of the newspapers from that time, prison solidarity newspapers. So I think that consciousness, while it's oftentimes difficult because there is this sort of like hyper-racialization that goes on that makes people only see their own, you know, my own group as I got to defend myself, I got to get with my own group. Attica was one of those times where you actually saw multiracial solidarity, right? You had, you know, Latinx, Black folks. It was predominantly Black, but, you know, there were Black folks led, but white folks were there. You know, radical white people were there in solidarity. There were radical white prisoners that are part of it. And I think that's something that's the most fearful to people who run the prisons, is that kind of unity. But I think that's the struggle that you know, the prisoners on the inside, but also organizers on the outside, have to keep working on. How do we create that solidarity within the prison state, but also understand the international relationships? I think another thing I'm really interested in with Attica is they had a set of 27 demands. Then they had 6 demands after they took the prison. And the second demand was that they wanted to be able to leave and go to a non-imperialist country, right? They wanted to get out of the United States and go to a non-imperialist country. So, you know, they saw that there was this sort of relationship they could have, like in Algeria or other places, that would be more suitable to Black folks and other people who were oppressed in the United States. But I think that's still a struggle, but I think that you see the possibility going on in the prisons. And today, one thing I am really proud about is like groups like the Free Alabama movement, the jailhouse lawyers. Like, these groups are really trying to create that solidarity, trying to bring the solidarity for incarcerated people, bring them together. Even like the IWOC, Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, right? It's trying to bring folks together to recognize that in prison, like they're actually, that, you know, even though race is definitely there, and you can't deny racism and the way that the guards use racism to kind of keep people fighting against each other. A lot of times prisoners and the most organized prisoners see themselves as a class, right? They're a class together. They're the ones, and they see that the system is suited against them. And so organizing that way is very important. But I think that solidarity within prisons, but also outside and even international, is essential in order for us to organize and to kind of defeat racial capitalism.
Let me bring this, last question, which is in many ways related to the previous one. Antonia Carcena is asking, how can we move forward a global solidarity agenda surrounding prison abolition? And we have few minutes, so please, Milena.
Yeah, great that we went to this question next, because I wanted to agree with everything that Anthony said, and we are seeing this on ground here in Palestine. And as an organization that we work with other civil society organizations internationally and regionally, we have reached a realization that it is solidarity between between the different prisoners that will help the whole prison abolition, and we do agree with this 100%. So the global solidarity agenda, what what we can do to move forward. So, for example, the security systems that are implemented in the different and various prisons across the world, there are similar security systems that operate in all prisons. So what we thought about doing is like collective and joint support and work between solidarity groups from across the world, targeting these security systems that operate in discriminatory and illegal prisons, for example. We talk about collective and joint advocacy regarding intersecting struggles such as racial policies or discriminatory policies. So there, I'm sure our countries or our governments' countries have joint trainings between Israel, so between prison guards or prison systems or whatnot. So we should, as a solidarity group, all across, not only like from Palestine or only from the US or only from Brazil, as a whole community and solidarity group against this abolition, against the prisons, we should work together to target these things. And I truly believe this is what makes our governments, or not in our case, not our government, our occupying people's government and your governments scared or threatened by this movement, is when they do see concrete action taken on ground. Sorry, just a simple example of Ben & Jerry's, who, as a company, they decided to stop their products in Israeli settlements, and the whole Israeli government started this crazy phenomena against Ben & Jerry's, and they started moving and understanding that, okay, people are watching us, we might, I don't know, let's do something, let's not do something. So what I'm trying to say is what Anthony beautifully said. It's the solidarity between our movements that will help the agenda for like prison abolition to move forward. We need to act together and target those individuals who have an integral role in sustaining and keeping prisons alive.
Thank you, Juliana. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to just to say that I agree with what both my colleagues have said, and add that here, that from the perspective of Latin America, we always say that the colonization of the word, of its racialization of the word, and vice versa, right? It's something that is not from Latin America, but I feel that at least when we struggle in the fights that we're here to understand Latin America, is the way that we use to understand our situation. And we keep saying that, well, not every place is gonna have a system of, came from a system of plantations like we did, of indigenous genocide like we did, and racial categories are not going to apply in the same way in different places. But we understand that there was a moment in history that the world was divided between humans and non-humans, right? And in this moment in which in shattered slavery, that Black people were considered those who were literally commodities. It was not even labor workers, it was those who can trade in a capitalist system. So, and from that moment, the whole world was divided between those who deserved to have. There was a new concept. Silver Winter are going to say that there's a new concept of humanity, in which the world was divided. If you take like the text from the 18th century, I have worked a lot of them. They're going to say, oh, the Asians are the yellow, so they're subhumans. The Africans are the non-humans. The Americans, the Latin Americans were the mestizos, the non-humans. And then they divided just what is the class that's dominated, the ethno-white class in that sense. So even though that some racial categories does not make sense in other contexts, like the racial categories change depend on the context, we understand that imperialism and colonialism are all racial systems in that sense. And based on that, we also understand that they work together now and then. So I think that they struggle in, when Milena talks about how also the right-wing groups are articulating in a sense. So when Bolsonaro, that is the current far-right president that we have, when he was elected, the Prime Minister of Israel was one of the first ones to call and congratulate him. And all the speeches, we actually have videos of that, speeches in which he's saying that quilombolas, there are communities, black communities, ancestral black communities in Brazil, that they're laced, fat, and say a lot of bad things. He was in a Congress that he had the Israel flag behind him. You know, so we see that the connections, we see that the kind of militarized police that have now, they do receive trainings that not only exchanged with Israel, but Brazil was one of the countries who led Haiti occupation after the hurricane. Yeah, the hurricane, and the kinds of things that they used there of violence, militarized violence that they used there after they came back and they used it in the favelas. You know, so we understand that they are connected, and we also need to be connected to fight against them. And in that sense, I just want to remember two things, and I don't want to extend too much, that in the Durban conference, that was for those who know, was a United Nations conference against racism. We had the Black movement as a whole, but in Latin America, Black movement, there's a lot of mobilization on that. We had two main proposals. The first one, it was for Zionism be considered a form of racism. And it was in this proposal that Israel and the United States left the conference. And the second one was for reparation. That not in US, we discuss a lot, right, about reparation nowadays, but that time we're also discussing for kind of change the global economy in the sense of making all the countries that profit from slavery in colonization to pay reparations for all the countries that they exploited. And then almost every country left. All the European countries left that conference. So global solidarity is in a long time because we understand that our struggles are connected. And this was there like a lot of years ago. And nowadays, when in the protest, the last picture that I showed of the protest, there were Colombian flags, there was Palestinian flags with people, because we were afraid to go to the streets because of how pandemic was hard here. But then when you saw what was going on in Palestine, what was going on in Colombia at the same period, we just went to the streets. You know, it's exchange. When George Floyd died in the US, we were in protest here because of the killing of João Pedro, but you also continue to go to the streets, this time carrying George Floyd and João Pedro's names. You know, so it's basically, and the prisons fits on that, because if you're fighting for not re-signify, which means being human, but to connect with all those of us who are considered non-human in one part of history, you know, and say, hey, this logic of oppression, then you also need to end prisons of the places, because it's one of the sites that most perpetuates the idea of what some people could be a non-human being, you know. So yeah, I think that is just that, and saying that nowadays the other struggles in the world are inspiring us, and you try to continue and move forward in solidarity with them.
Thank you, and what a wonderful way to conclude the panel, the idea of decolonizing the human to include all the wretched of the earth, brown, black, indigenous people as part of the human, and part of what abolition really means. Thank you all three for inspiring presentations and really fascinating discussion, and I think this is the beginning of an ongoing debate and conversation among people who are located in different places, engaged in different struggles, because we really need to have more networking and more conversation like this. Thank you very much.